one of the interesting things about our location here is that just over to my right here, you've got all these boats which are obviously out hoping for salmon right now. These are recreational boats. Yeah. And these are all salmon that are heading for the Capilano River, the Seymour River, maybe on up all the way up to Indian Arm, on Deep Cove and so on. Yeah. But then, of course, just around the corner, we've got the Fraser, which has had a record year, biggest year since 1913 in terms of its overall returns. And so we're right in the middle of this sort of juncture between two different groups of salmon, the ones heading for the North Shore rivers, many of which have been dammed, and so there's hatcheries keeping those going. Right. And then up the Fraser, where there's no major dams on the main stem, and they've had just a roller coaster the last few years. Right.
And so Sockeye salmon really strong this year, the run. I'm a neophyte. Can you explain why that is and why it might have taken so many by surprise?
Well, it's been really weird because last year it took everybody by surprise because we only had about 1.5 million fish come back out of a forecast of over 10. So that really got people worried because this seemed to be the end of a fairly long downward trend we've had in overall productivity. That meant when it came time for the forecasters to say how many fish they think they're going to get this year, of course they're not going to run off and say, oh, we think we're going to get millions, because that would be very bad if they were way off again. And sure enough, they came back more strongly than ever seen in anybody's lifetime. And the best guess we have is that the ocean conditions were very good 2 years ago when these juvenile sockeye went out to sea. And that's with hindsight, we can sort of think we can see that in the water temperatures were good in the Fraser, but in the lower Strait of Georgia. But I must admit, really nobody could claim to have seen this amazing return coming, and they really couldn't have seen the disaster last year either. Right.
So sockeye, are they returning to all the rivers you mentioned? Are they more specific to different rivers have different runs of different species of salmon, or what other species are going up the Cap River, for instance?
So the Capilano River is primarily going to be Chinook and Coho and some steelhead. Steelhead are really honorary salmon. They just happen to spawn in the spring instead of the fall, but they still will run up in the fall. The sockeye need a lake. So for sockeye to survive, the juveniles have to have access to a lake they can get into for 1 year. So there is no such thing that they can deal with in Seymour or in the Capilano.
Got it.
But so they're not in those systems, but they do. They certainly are in most of the any other big stream that's got a lake on it will have sockeye. If you look up, beyond us here, straight up Burrard Inlet, you can get all 5 species of salmon, as well as steelhead in small numbers. Will go up all the way up the Indian River at the far end of Indian Arm, which must be about 40 kilometers from here, I would guess. So we do get all of those there. And the funny thing too is that with pink salmon, that's the one we're not going to have this year, because down south here they only come in odd years. So it has a 2-year life cycle, and they're only here in odd years. So we had 30 plus million come through the Fraser last year, none this year as we know, and then we'll again see whether they come past us again the following year.
And last year, the pink salmon run in the Fraser, would that be considered a strong year?
It was huge, absolutely huge. So you had the sockeye that just were disastrous, and then the sub-story here, which nobody had talked about, was that the pinks were absolutely enormous. They're not as valuable to the commercial fisheries, so they don't tend to get as much attention, but they're lots of fun for the anglers, and they're certainly perfectly good to eat. So we had sort of a mixed story last year.
Interesting.
And one of the nice things about all the pinks coming back is that salmon are very important. When they die, their bodies help fertilize streams, and when bears and other animals take them into the forest, they can even fertilize land plants and insects, and ultimately work their way up through the food web. So there was a lot of concern when the sockeye didn't show up that they were going to lose their usual annual pulse of nutrients. But then the pink surprised everybody, came in huge numbers, and although they don't go nearly as far up the Fraser, they're only in the lower Fraser. Nonetheless, that would certainly be good news for things like sturgeon, which can depend to a large extent on eating pinks, both their adults and also their young. So again, it's just a mixed story. We have a diverse portfolio of salmon. Fortunately, they don't all do badly at the same time, and sometimes they evidently can do quite well.
And surprise us.
And surprise us.
What are the reproductive cycles of different species of salmon? And how many years do the different species from when they till they return to the river?
Right. So the reproductive cycle depends on species.
Yeah.
And in fact, some species it varies from one river to the next.
Yeah.
Pink salmon they're the quick returners. They only have 18 months at sea, 6 months roughly in freshwater, and that's it, 2-year life cycle.
Yeah.
Sockeye typically have a 4-year life cycle,
Yeah.
so they would have 2 years at sea, roughly 2 years in total in freshwater. The Chinook can spend longer at sea, but often they're coming back at a similar sort of age. And Cove typically maybe 3 to 4 year life cycle. So it really varies from one species to the next.
And what are the longest duration that any species will spend at sea before they return?
Oh, I don't know what the world record would be, but I would pick Chinook. It's the big one. It's the massive one everybody likes to catch, the spring salmon. And so with some of these monster fish that you see people holding that are 60, 70 pounds, those fish have got to be, I would guess, 6, 7, 8 years old, maybe even.
Yeah.
They will have stayed a very long time.
Yeah.
See, when the fish are at sea, they can grow faster. They have more food. That's why they go to sea, fundamentally. When they're in freshwater, they have less food, but they tend to have fewer predators. And so this is the trade-off that they're doing. So if you get a fish that stays an extra year at sea, it's going to be definitely that much bigger.
Right.